Chapter 49. Who started it? Briefly and roughly stated, the answer is that the government of Austria-Hungary started its local war with Serbia, while Germany's military leaders started the worldwide war against France and Russia that became known as the First World War or the Great War. Wars in the modern world tend to break out for a complex of reasons, and to involve a multitude of participants at various levels in the decision-making process. Impersonal forces can come into play, as can institutional pressures. Cultural predilections and affinities can shape events. The varied interests at work in a modern society often make domestic politics as much a focus of concern as international relations in determining whether and when countries go to war. Even so, accidents, blunders, misunderstandings, the characteristics of individuals, and other random factors continue to explain much of what actually happens. The peculiarity of the First World War is that, even though it occurred in modern times, somewhat democratic and, to an extent, responsive to the voices of the public, its origins involved so few people, a handful in a handful of countries. It is not just that a tiny number of individuals made the decisions, it is startling that few people even knew that anything was happening or that decisions were there to be made or were being made. It was a crisis that arose and was played out in secret. Of course, seen in broader perspective, powerful forces were at work over the course of decades and even centuries that created the world in which the Great War broke out, the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, the spread of nationalism, the rise of science, the triumph of imperialism, and the militarism of German society that was a product of how Germany was united in the 1860s and 1870s. But none of these mass movements and happenings explain the immediate outbreak of the war. None reveal why Europe did not put a match to the explosive material in the summer of 1913 but did so in the summer of 1914. The people who lit the fuse were, of course, the products of their family backgrounds, of their societies, and of the historical circumstances in which they acted. Nor did they, nor could anybody, really speak for themselves alone. When Moltke, for example, spoke, he did so for the 650 members of the Great General Staff and, to some extent, for the officer corps as a whole. He spoke with the weight of his office, he was more than just an individual. In suggesting that one or more individuals started the First World War, I am using words in their most everyday and ordinary sense. I mean that there were men who wanted to start a war, and who deliberately acted in such a way as to start one, and who succeeded, by what they did, in starting a war. So the detective in a murder mystery, summing up the evidence for the houseguests in the library, might point a finger accusingly and say, there is the person who did it. In the case of Germany we point to Moltke. He started the World War, and he did so deliberately. In the case of the Austro-Serbian War, the obvious criminal was Gavrilo Princip. The teenage drifter and failed poet probably, though not certainly, conceived the Sarajevo murder plot, led it, and by his determination and persistence carried it through despite orders to abort, pleas to turn back, and changes of circumstance. But Princip did not intend to inspire Austria to invade Serbia. Quite the contrary, under questioning by his captors he attempted to keep them from learning of any connection between the Serbs and himself. Moreover, the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Office was at work planning the destruction of Serbia even before Princip struck. The troubled and confused adolescent terrorist did indeed open the door to the Austrian invasion by killing the Archduke who had been blocking the way, but Princip did not know that, what he did, in that respect, was inadvertent. Kaiser Wilhelm, Chancellor Bateman, Foreign Minister Jago, and an assortment of their German military and civilian colleagues encouraged the Austrians to launch an attack on Serbia, and so were directly responsible for that war. In the case of the Kaiser, there was mitigation. When it looked as though there were a peaceful solution, he opted for it enthusiastically. Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Count Leopold von Berchtold was the man most responsible for bringing about the Serbian War. Sometime during or after the Balkan Wars he decided that his country could survive only if Serbia were crushed and altogether eliminated as a factor in politics. He seems to have believed that a merely diplomatic triumph would be insubstantial and might not last. Only victory in war would achieve his goal, and that could be accomplished only if Germany would keep Russia from interfering, while big Austria-Hungary crushed little Serbia. As soon as Germany's blank check was received, Berchtold put himself to work starting his war. He was, like Princip, persistent and undiscouraged. He refused to be turned aside. He would not be drawn into conversations or negotiations that might trap him into keeping the peace, even, and this confused other leaders, on favorable terms. The other players in European politics found the July crisis uniquely puzzling because they sensed they were missing something. What they were missing was the knowledge that Vienna did not want peace. They assumed that Berchtold hoped to secure his terms, which might well have been extreme. But he did not desire his terms or any terms, he preferred to fight a war. After the war, as his envoy Count Hoyos made clear in July 1914 in conversations in Berlin, he did not want, as the Kaiser wanted, a subservient Serbia, he wanted there to be no Serbia at all. To the problem posed for his country by Serbia, he wanted, one might say, a final solution. Berchtold operated under severe handicaps. The machinery of the Austro-Hungarian state moved with maddening slowness. He could not move swiftly enough to achieve the fait accompli that the Germans asked. Everything took time during which the powers might impose a peace. Since his armies could not move for weeks, he declared war anyway, doing nothing but using the at-war status to fend off potential peacemakers. Berchtold was surrounded by his Foreign Office staff, the firebrands inherited from E. Renthal. They may have inspired him. The cabinet of Austro-Hungary, even Tisza, after holding out against him for a week, supported him. All shared his responsibility for the war. It need hardly be said that Conrad was Berchtold's full partner in starting the war. Berchtold had one great asset in pursuing his goal. The foreign minister of any other great power would have been reined in by his allies. If Russia wanted to invade a neighbor, France, which financed Russia's military expansion, would keep St. Petersburg from doing so. When Germany meddled in Morocco in 1911, even Austria refused support and thereby helped stop Berlin. Only one country in Europe had an ally that would not restrain it, that would support it blindly. That was Austria, backed unconditionally by Germany, and against all odds that was the one country in Europe that was led by a man who was determined to start a war. Why was Berchtold able to start a war? The answer is, because there was nobody to stop him. He was the only leader in Europe, we now know, whose ally gave him carte blanche. It should be noted, though, that he did not use it on his own. He declared war only when, and because, the German foreign minister, Jago, told him to do so. So Jago was one more person who started the Austro-Serbian War. In the case of the preventive war against Russia and France, it had been contemplated by the leaders of the German army for a long time. It was a policy proposal that tended to surface whenever crises emerged. Moltke is the one usually quoted as advancing it, but he seems to have spoken for the officer corps as a whole. When the July crisis blew up, therefore, it looked to the German generals like the time to act rather than merely talk. Falkenhayn and Moltke took the lead. They were the officers, supported by their military colleagues, who made the real decision for war in the summer of 1914. They thought they knew what they were doing. Moltke had predicted that the war would lead European civilization to ruin, but he felt the war to be inevitable. He believed that all he was deciding, all that he was in a position to decide, was when it would take place. And he did decide that. Here again it confuses the issue to think in terms of one war rather than two. At the outset, at the time of the outrage and the blank check, there was only the Serbian war initiative on the table. War was proposed by the Austrians. But it was the civilian government of Germany that crafted an actual plan of operations for Austria. And it was that civilian government, the Chancellor and his Foreign Office, that monitored Austria's performance. So little progress had been made by the dual monarchy in initiating a war by the last week of July, according to Germany's generals, or in arriving at a settlement, according to the Kaiser, that neither side in Germany was willing to let the Chancellor, the Foreign Office, and the Austrians continue to be in charge of the operation. Vienna had wanted to start and win a war, but as of the end of July had failed to do so. All it had created was what it, and the Kaiser and Bateman, had wanted not to create, a war crisis, involving, to some extent, all the powers of Europe. But the German generals began to see that a war crisis was something they did want. Such a war crisis, and such internationalization, created confusion. As spectators during July, Moltke, Falkenhayn, and Germany's other military leaders pondered the uses to which such confusion could be put. They had been willing to let Austria have its Serbian adventure, although it meant little to Germany, but now Austria had bungled it, and in doing so had involved itself perhaps inextricably, so Germany now could count on the Austro-Hungarian Empire's full support in launching a new war initiative of Germany's own, a war against the other powers of Europe. The German government therefore was in the process of changing its policy from the weekend of July 25 onward. The Kaiser and the Chancellor, albeit with some misgivings, let Moltke and Falkenhayn have their way. In the confusion of a European war crisis, the German generals cleverly substituted one war for another. The world was deluded into believing, then and thereafter, that one grew out of the other, but it was not so. One had to be overridden in order to pursue the other. On the part of Moltke and Falkenhayn, it was a supreme act of opportunism. They saw their opening and swiftly took advantage of it. It was as though they had seen a passenger airliner parked on a runway, fully fueled and ready to take off, boarded it and commandeered it, and at gunpoint forced the captain to divert from his scheduled destination to someplace in the opposite direction. Moltke and Falkenhayn had succeeded in an unprecedented act of political hijacking. They had taken over Berchtold's war against Serbia, and had forced it instead to take them to their own war against France and Russia.